This week, Tim draws our attention to the advantages of renting.
Well, I guess at a risk of an overgeneralisation, because it does really depend, as you'd be aware, on the particular area where you're looking. But in some cases, it is cheaper to be renting in that area than it is to try and acquire the property. But that's, I guess, a year-on-year thing, and certainly I would always advocate the acquisition of property.
My dad always said to me from when I was about 17, you have to own property, you must own your own home, the great Australian dream. Does this mean that we no longer need to own property?
I think it is important that we do own property, but it may be the case because of your personal circumstances and a series of other things that you can still own property, but your home could be a rental premises because that satisfies your requirement at that particular time in your life. You're living there on a contract or whatever the case may be.
Okay.
So you don't necessarily have to own the house you live in.
What are the good things about renting?
The good things about renting is that you can, as we said a while ago, acquire a property, I guess, of a higher standard than you could afford to buy, because on day one it is cheaper in most cases to be able to rent the property than to acquire that particular property. You also have the advantage, I suppose, of having somebody else with the worries of the maintenance of that property rather than yourself, and some of the other downsides of actually physically owning property.
What are the drawbacks, though? There are some significant ones.
Well, you're not acquiring an asset is the short story, and I think there is certainly an advantage in being able to ultimately own your home. I would always advocate the acquisition of your own home at some point. It's the great Australian dream, and there's no doubt that is why it's the Australian dream of actually owning your own plot of land in your own home.
Well, of course, if you can get onto a property that does have some good growth, it's a capital gains tax-free asset, and therefore it can actually work out to be a pretty good investment for you.
Exactly right.
What are some of the other drawbacks of renting? For example, what about that whole tenure thing?
At the end of the day, you are in somebody else's property, and whilst you have a lease and you have a contract, which is a lease is just another form of a contract, it is tenuously, I guess, around the lease and the terms of that lease, and it isn't your home, and ultimately it may not be your premises because of a series of circumstances. So you've always got to be, I guess, a little bit concerned if you are renting that you don't have the freedom of being able to do the modifications to the property and a variety of other things that you can do to the property if it is yours.
Okay, now if you're a first-time renter, maybe you've always owned your own property and you've decided to rent, or you're new to the market, how can you go about getting rental references? Because that's what people always seem to want.
That's a difficult one, and yes, sometimes I guess when you're getting into that market you do need other people to verify your capacity to be able to satisfy the obligations of being a tenant. Some of those obligations obviously financial, some of them more about not damaging the property, and you may need in the early stages when you are a first-time tenant to have other people verify that. We see that sometimes with I guess people coming from overseas, that they will have their employer say this person is of this particular I attest to their character, and here is a letter in support of their salary, and we're of the view that they'll be able to satisfy the financial obligations around the lease.
So from a cash flow perspective, when does buying become better than renting?
Oh, good question. It is cheaper on day one in most cases to rent the property, but once you've bought the property you're locked in. So subject to fluctuations with interest rates, as you move down and your salary goes up, the repayments on your property pretty much remain the same. So over a period of time you start to get more and more ability to be able to meet the payments, but the rent is obviously increasing with CPI and other factors. So at a particular point, and it depends on the area and the property you've purchased, it is actually cheaper to own the property as far as cash flow is going out than it is to rent. The early stages it's quite difficult, and I accept that, but at some point down that timeline it becomes cheaper at a cash flow point of view to actually own the property.
Now what I take from that, Tim, is what we said earlier in the piece, which is that even though it's important to own property, it doesn't actually have to be your own home. You can actually affect that whole process that you're talking about in other property that you don't necessarily live in. You can still pay it off, you can still get some equity in other property and still be achieving similar goals by owning property. It just doesn't necessarily need to be the one that you live in.
No, that's certainly right. And as we discussed, it may be the case that it is in your particular circumstances far more convenient for you to own a property, and it may be far cheaper, depending on the circumstance, for you to own a property in another area and have that as an investment, and then to rent accommodation so that you are satisfying other requirements in your life.
Now, Tim, a lot of people think that once they become a renter that they have absolutely no rights whatsoever and all the responsibility, but that's not true. Under a lease agreement with a landlord, tenants do get certain rights.
There's a very detailed legislation that sets out the tenant's rights and obligations as the landlord, and in fact there is a regulation to the particular legislation here in New South Wales that actually gives the lease. So the government weren't prepared to actually specify what should be in the lease. They said, we'll take it a step further than that, here's the lease. So they were very, very keen to make sure that they regulated this very closely.